everyone, in this video we'll consider the large intestine and the defecation reflex. So this makes up the final segment of the digestive system. And so we're just going to draw in the large intestine and sort of all the components and label them quickly. And then we'll get to some of the functions. So we know that the small intestine ends with the ileum. So the last segment of the small intestine is ileum. And it actually dumps into the large intestine, and there's a sphincter that sort of determines when the ileum is able to release the contents into the large intestine, and it's guarded by the ileocecal valve. So certainly a smooth muscle again, and when it's relaxed, it allows the contents to dump into the first part of the large intestine, which is known as the cecum. So the cecum we know actually has also the appendix, a prominent feature of the cecum. And the appendix is it is suggested at this point to have some function in terms of the immune system. But a lot of times what happens is that some particles will get stuck in the appendix and it will cause it to become inflamed. And then we develop appendicitis and the appendix needs to come out. The cecum actually is sort of a remnant of an animal digestion process where we used to use it for like digestion of things like grass. But it's not... It doesn't have much else in terms of like a notable function in humans. We also notice the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. So those are the common segments of the large intestine. So like kind of like an up, across, and then over. And then from the descending colon, we progress to the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum and the anus. And one thing I want to point out is that at the anus, we have an internal anal sphincter and an external anal sphincter, and we'll talk more about those shortly. So the large intestine is about 3 inches in diameter, so maybe double or triple the diameter of the small intestine, and it's about 5 feet in length. And we notice that the shape of the intestine has these sort of like, it actually are like pouches, and they're called haustra. So the haustra are basically pouches that permit distension and elongation of the large intestine. So we know that when the large intestine is full, the belly can become distended and you can feel bloated. So let's talk a little bit about the functions of the large intestine. So absorption is a major function. Certainly not as much absorption as what happens in the small intestine, but still there's absorption. And things that we absorb are water, vitamins, bile salts, organic waste, and toxins. So a lot of bad stuff and a few things that make up the good stuff. Also, we have storage of fecal matter, which I think is kind of logical. And then lastly, we have compaction of stuff into feces. So the stuff could be anything that's basically left over that isn't absorbed in the small intestine and the large intestine. We're going to actually sort of make feces out of it. So the stuff in the large intestine largely moves through the ascending colon in sort of slow motion. And then when it moves to the transverse and the descending colon, it starts to move faster. One other thing I really want to mention about the large intestine is the presence of microflora. And this is basically intestinal bacteria. And there's tons of intestinal bacteria, but things like E. coli, salmonella, there's a whole bunch of them that we sort of associate as like bad, like we don't want to get these things. But really, these bacteria, they're actually more bacterial cells than are like human cells in the large intestine. And they have a symbiotic relationship with us. So, we feed them and they feed us and everything kind of works out. So we actually need these intestinal bacteria. And there's a couple things that they do that are really important, such as synthesis of certain vitamins like vitamin K and the B vitamins. They're also able to digest certain things that we otherwise, without the bacteria, wouldn't be able to digest. So the bacteria are actually really significant, and certain antibiotics can actually wipe out the intestinal bacteria. And the problem with this is that if those bacteria are wiped out, then we sort of lose some of the normal function of the large intestine, and we can actually have things like diarrhea. And so it sort of speaks to the significance of things like probiotics that allow for sort of reestablishment of the normal microflora in the large intestine. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about the rectal valves. So you can see that there are 3 rectal valves that are present. And the rectal valves actually serve to sort of keep the fecal matter sort of where it belongs. Instead of having it slide out kind of unexpectedly, we are able to control the excretion of feces and sort of save it for a convenient time. The other thing is that we get production of intestinal gas, especially with the microflora. And so another function of the rectal valves is that we are able to sort of squeeze around, like any gas can kind of squeeze around any fecal matter that may be present and be released. So when we get to the anus, we have what's called the anal sampling mechanism. And so when we have like stretch of the internal anal sphincter, we're able to determine whether or not it's liquid, solid, or gas that's actually present and help the brain sort of determine whether or not to release whatever the material is at that given time. So the internal anal sphincter is under involuntary control and the external anal sphincter is under voluntary control. And I want to talk for a moment about the defecation reflex. So anytime when we get to like the rectum and the anus where we have distension or stretch, we actually will activate sensory receptors that will travel to the spinal cord. So that's kind of our first sort of step here. And then that will cause a reflex motor response of contraction. And the contraction leads to increased distension. So this little circuit of stretch and then contraction and distension is called the defecation reflex. And so basically when we have this process enacted, if we have relaxation of the external anal sphincter. So we utilize the anal sampling mechanism to figure out if it's solid, liquid, or gas, and then we decide consciously whether or not to let whatever the material is be excreted. So if we relax the external anal sphincter, which is under voluntary control, then the internal anal sphincter will follow suit and it will relax as well. And so this actually triggers the defecation reflex, and this is a positive feedback response. So as excretion is occurring, we'll have increased stretch, increased contraction, increased distension, increased stretch, increased contraction, and so on. But conversely, if we don't have relaxation of the external anal sphincter, so the anal sampling mechanism says, this is not a good time, then instead, the rectum will actually accommodate the increase in stretch. And so eventually the internal anal sphincter will contract again, and so it'll actually prevent unexpected or untimely excretion of fecal matter. So that actually covers our explanation of the large intestine and the defecation reflex. Obviously, there's opportunity for more detail in terms of how things are absorbed in the large intestine, but I think that the object is really to be able to identify what happens mostly in the large intestine and to understand the role of voluntary versus involuntary control over the defecation reflex. And so it actually wraps up our explanation of the digestive system. And as we move into nutrition and metabolism, we'll talk more about what happens with the nutrients after they're absorbed in the small intestine and taken to the liver for processing. All right, so that's all for now. Thanks for watching.